Hello everyone, welcome to tonight's event and thanks for coming. I just need to do a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Lucy and Harriet. Thanks to Harriet and Ida Down Books for doing the series with us. Thanks to Benjamin Gorman who's signing for us tonight, and Louise who's going to be doing the captions for us. If you have trouble seeing Benjamin during the PowerPoint presentation, there should be a tab in the middle of the screen which you can just drag over to the left to enlarge it a bit so you can see it more clearly. Also, thanks to the Arts Council for making these events possible with a bit of lottery funding. Do feel free to ask questions all the way through, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom because the questions in the chat box do tend to get lost. But now I'll just hand over to Harriet and Lucy. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. Good evening and welcome to the third of 5 night school events which are taking place throughout Women's History Month in partnership with 5 Leaves Bookshop, celebrating some brilliant women artists. I'm Harriet Olsen and I'm the founder of Ida Down Books. For anyone who joined us last week, you'll have already heard me say a bit about why I set up Ida Down Books, which is to get more books about women artists onto the bookshelves, and about how we do that, which is that we amplify women's voices by working with female art historians and curators to write our books, and we champion creative women by working with female book designers and typographers. The artists we're featuring in these night school talks are all from our Modern Women Artists series. And the books in this series, as you'll notice if you've bought one, and thank you if you have, are modest little books. People often compare them to ladybird books for grown-ups, which I take as a huge compliment. Because when I first started thinking about creating a series of books about women artists who were working in the 20th century and who have subsequently been overlooked, overshadowed, or forgotten, I knew I wanted them to be concise introductions as a way of encouraging people who had no prior knowledge of these women to take a chance and buy a book. These books offer a first look at the amazing work these women were making. They aren't, and were never intended to be, the definitive book on or the catalogue raisonné for. I hope those books will come for each of these artists, and that these little books are only the beginning of a change in art book publishing which needs to happen. There is a lot of work to do in terms of filling in the gaps, particularly in 20th century art history. You might have seen yesterday a huge project just announced, which the National Portrait Gallery are undertaking over the next 3 years, to also start addressing this imbalance which exists in our collective knowledge about women who achieved great things alongside their male contemporaries, but who have fallen out of the history books. With the first 5 books in our Modern Women Artists series, which we launched all at the same time at the London Art Book Fair, I was keen to invite authors who to write on artists who would show a range of disciplines. So we had, very quickly, Sylvia Pankhurst, who exemplifies the creative life of a woman artist, not the oil on canvas exhibition work, which was the preserve of male artists. We heard from our author, Katie Norris, in the first week of these night school events, how Pankhurst's art encompassed murals and portraits and emblems and the decorative arts, a much wider artistic field than we usually acknowledge in order to define the artist. We also have Frances Hodgkins, who fits into a modernist narrative, but who merged figurative and landscape representation. And also in this book, we introduce the importance of her textile designs, which tends to get overlooked, again, because it's not exhibition work. Book 4 was on Laura Knight, who we heard Alice Strickland speaking about last week. And Knight was working in a completely and firmly within an English figurative realist tradition. Lee Miller, a really important photographer, but someone who usually only ever gets spoken about through the lens of the men in her life, as the wife of, as the lover of, as the muse of, rather than as an artist in her own right. And then we have Marlow Moss, who is completely non-figurative, entirely abstract, totally unlike anything else we have from the other artists featured in the series so far. I first really paid attention to Marlow Moss's work in an exhibition called Virginia Woolf, an exhibition inspired by her writings, which was curated by Laura Smith, who is the author of our latest book in the series, book number 6 on Eileen Agar, who we will hear about in next week's talk. In that exhibition, Marlow Moss's small sculpture called Balanced Forms in Gunmetal on Cornish Granite was paired in a vitrine with Paul Vézelé's sculpture 5 Forms. And those two quite small works, they could almost be maquettes for larger sculptures, packed such a powerful punch. I became really quite obsessed with both of those artists, and Marlow Moss in particular, but I could find very little published about her. The exhibition which I saw in Chichester was a year after Lucy Howarth, our speaker tonight and author of the Eider Down books volume on Marlow Moss, had curated an important solo exhibition of Moss's work at Museum Haus Constructive in Zurich. And in turn, that exhibition had followed a major touring show here in the UK of Moss's work, which Lucy co-curated, and which travelled from Tate St Ives to Leeds Art Gallery to the Jerwood Gallery in Hastings, and then on to Tate Britain. And these exhibitions all stemmed from her PhD thesis in 2008 about the little known Marlow Moss. So it's no understatement to say that Lucy is this country's, maybe even the world's, leading authority on Marlow Moss. And I'm delighted that she's the author for our book and that she's joining us tonight to introduce you all to the wonderful Marlow Moss. In a moment, I will hand over the screen to Lucy for her talk, and then I will come back at the end to take any questions that you would like to ask, which, as Simon says, you need to put in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can do that while Lucy's talking. Okay, enough from me, and over to Lucy. Thank you.
Many thanks to Simon and Pippa and everyone at 5 Leaves for hosting this event, and to Benjamin for the BSL interpretation, and to Harriet for making Marlow Moss part of the Eider Down Books Modern Women Artists series. I'm so excited for this endeavour as more titles are added to the list and more voices are included in this vital discourse. I'm looking forward to reading the new Eider Down books, Laura Smith on Eileen Agar, and soon Alicia Foster on Nina Hamlet. My order is in. It was great to listen to Alice Strickland last week talking about Laura Knight, an artist who, like Moss, made her home in the far west of Cornwall in Lamorna. But she could not be more different from Moss in style and approach. When I first came across Marlow Moss in the early 2000s, she was rather a mystery. It was difficult to see actual works, most being in private collections or even lost, or to find reproductions in print or on the internet. By luck, I caught a couple of paintings in galleries in London, Offa Waterman and Jonathan Clark, and one on the wall at Tate St Ives. Circulating facts were often wrong or disputed. Sources were scarce. Reading about the Marlow Moss reconstruction project by Dutch artist Florette Dijkstra in the early 90s was fascinating for me and kickstarted my own research and PhD. The poster that you see behind me is from a 1994 exhibition in Arnhem in the Netherlands. It has the date of Moss's birth a year off, and this erroneous information may have come from Moss herself and was certainly repeated by her partner Nettie Nijhoff, whether deliberately misleading or not. Moss was, and often is, often presumed to be a man by institutions and in publication. Here, we celebrate Moss as a modern woman artist, but defining her by gender is problematic. This is something I've discussed recently in my article on the Art UK website. Moss was British, born in London in 1889, but that too is not characteristic as such, as she was in most ways a European artist. She started her career in Paris between the wars and then lived and worked in hinterlands of various sorts in France and the Netherlands, and latterly Cornwall, where she died in 1958. As is often true of singular individuals, Moss is located in the space between things. Through a study of her work and the way she lived her life, social gender constructs can be explored, and the language of modern art and its histories, but categories are evaded. We can frame Moss as female and therefore lesbian, but her queerness arguably supersedes this. The only identity Moss embraced was that of an artist. Other identities that can be invoked, Jewish, English, upper middle class, middle-aged, female, she discarded to varying degrees. That is not to say that it is not interesting and often urgently vital to apply such distinctions now as a method of revising histories and rediscovering neglected figures and practices. But such normative categories must be recognized as transitory, lenses that help us to see a person or body of work that exists by itself anyway. As far as we know, she self-named as Marlow. When filling out the form to join the Artists International Association as a professional member in 1942, Moss ignores the request to identify as Mr., Mrs. or Miss, and instead she states her name as Moss, Marlow, and then Marlow Moss in brackets for clarity. It is interesting here to see she defines her practice as abstract painting, sculpture, and relief. She might also have included drawing, as at this point, particularly, her output in that area was prolific. All Moss's important teachers, artistic, intellectual influences, comrades and friends were European. Her work developed out of the European tradition of constructivist art, de Stijl, the Bauhaus, and Abstraction-Création. This lozenge, oil on canvas of 1935, clearly relates to that tradition, and yet it is uniquely Moss's own, perfectly balanced in its expression of space, movement, and light. The double lines in red rather than black are particularly a distinguishing feature. This is a very beautiful work, deceptively simple and strikingly elegant. As your eye tracks around the design, elements come to the fore and recede sequentially and simultaneously. The square of the canvas, a balanced form in itself already, is orientated to its diagonal, creating a diamond. The perpendicular is then re-established by the painted lines, horizontal and vertical orthogonals. A smaller square is formed off-center, its corner almost touching the edge, but not quite. Its edges echoed outwards. The symmetry of the outer red verticals is broken by the longest vertical. Two lines run in parallel trams, both vertically and horizontally, although the latter does not reach the other side of the composition, interrupted as they are by the white area containing the grey line, or is it a form? Figure-ground relationships oscillate. Three-dimensional space is apparent. Things aren't just happening on the surface of the canvas. Of the three red horizontals and the three red verticals, none is dominant. The elements are in constant flux. The crossing points of the red lines causes an intense visual effect, a flicker. The experience of standing in front of this work, as I did at last during the exhibition I co-curated at Zurich's Museum Haus Constructive in 2017, is overwhelmingly one of lightness. White, red and grey was previously exhibited in Switzerland 80 years earlier in the seminal exhibition Constructivisten in Basel in 1937. Moss took part in this and Abstract Kunst at the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam the following year, two of the most important pre-war showcases of the non-figurative European modernist movement. During the war, Moss returned to England and settled in Cornwall, her childhood sanctuary, where she had convalesced from a bout of tuberculosis, rather than heading to New York as other artists did, such as her important friend Piet Mondrian. When she arrived in Lamorna in 1940, alone and without her work, most of which remained at her Normandy home and was later destroyed by a German bomb, she established a studio and continued her practice in relative isolation. In her last 5 years, Moss was busy. There were two retrospective exhibitions of her work at the Hanover Gallery in London in 1953 and 1958, and she took part in several group shows, including Group Espace at the Royal Festival Hall in 1955 and a show in New York in 1956. If you flick on actually a slide there, we've got the private view invitation for the 1958 Hanover Gallery show, which is rather nice. She continued to exhibit regularly in Paris with the Salon des Réalités Nouvelles and took part in the exhibition 50 Years of Abstract Painting there in 1957. She had a couple of exhibitions locally in Cornwall too, at the Ara Gallery in Mousehole in the late 40s. This is a work that I've come to know only recently with a collection that is currently with the Mayor Gallery on Cork Street in London. And the collection has been partially on loan to Tadeusz Ropak for the exhibition Female Minimal that sadly I was not able to see because of lockdown restrictions. The drawing is one of a few Moss made in the 1940s that include orbiting circles. Such forms also appear in her sculptures, but it should not necessarily be considered a preparatory drawing for sculpture, although the calculations and marginalia, I'm not sure if you can make it out on the image, there's labels, a key of sorts, labels A to F, and they indicate that this is part of a thought process, maybe for another work, although maybe all of Moss's work can be seen like this. The text from one of the little Ara Gallery catalogues of drawings such as these gives Moss's characteristically compact account of her work, and I'll read you a section here. Moss says, "I would like to ask the public to look at the works as free as possible from preconceived ideas on art. These drawings are constructed on a very simple principle, a geometrical figure, sometimes broken, sometimes cut, sometimes divided, sometimes subdivided, until the relation of the lines to each other produce an aesthetic emotion. If one considers the lines in these drawings as sounds, note or chord progressions, and geometrical figures as the musical key, one can, to a certain extent, compare these drawings to music. Music is the art of combining sounds with a view to beauty of form. This work aims at beauty of form by coordinating form and line on the plane. Quoting from Plato, what I understand by beauty of form is something characterized by straight lines and circles, surfaces and solid bodies composed with the straight line and the circle, using the set square and the plumb. For these forms are not like the others, natural forms, beautiful under certain conditions, but they are always beautiful in themselves. Despite living in Cornwall, Moss did not forge a connection with the St. Ives artists such as Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth. This was not through lack of trying on her part. She wrote to Nicholson and he ignored her. I always feel it was a shame that Moss didn't approach Hepworth directly rather than writing to her husband. I think Moss and Hepworth had more in common with their work, but maybe sisterhood was not on offer. Like many artists of the 20th century, Moss's aesthetic was deeply affected by science and technology. The arrival of submicroscopic and atomic science precipitated an inward gaze to the structure of things. If life itself was subject to knowable patterns, then so must art be, only the essential. Advances in manufacture opened up a whole new range of materials and mediums to artists in practical terms, but also conceptually. The separation between art and matter was clarified. The age of mass mechanical production allowed a shift in emphasis from single handcrafted objects to art as series or industrial scale art, or art without the touch of the human hand. This was also a reflection of the political world, with the rise of the proletariat and the demise of the aristocracy, most directly exemplified in Bolshevik Russia, where the constructivist movement originated. In some ways, art was democratized. This work, Construction Spatial of 1953, contains the orbital forms often seen in the drawings, and also a found object or surrealist aspect with the use of adjustable legs, like some sort of engineering instrument. It is almost alien in its appearance, the larger body an ovoid, an egg, a pod, the smaller a sphere. They are planetary and atomic, somewhere between natural and cultural, futuristic, sci-fi, and even humorful. It's hard not to ascribe these tripods with personality and a relationship. Moss gives no clue as to what it might mean. The connection between non-figurative art and liberal politics was made overt in the 1933 issue of Abstraction Création Art Non-Figuratif. Moss was a founding member of this Parisian association, where the editorial states, "Any attempt to limit artistic efforts according to considerations of race, ideology, or nationality is intolerable. We commit this journal to total opposition to all oppression of whatever kind." That said, not many on the list here that you can see down the side of the page, not many of those names are female. You can see Barbara Hepworth is oddly listed under her first name at the top there. And then we've got Catherine Dreyer, Evie Hone, Katarzyna Kobra, Hannah Kosnick-Kloss, Sophie Tober-Arp, Sonia Deloney had been in the first issue, but she's no longer on the list here. And I think that is it. Many of the prominent figures of 20th century abstract art, most notably Mondrian, had been drawn to mysticism and theosophy. Moss was not. Nehov described her as an atheist. This unpublished essay by Moss begins by overtly connecting art to the human mind. I don't know if you can read it from the screen, but she says, Works of art are the creations and expressions of conscious minds. Outside man, art does not exist. Revealingly, she has written, and subsequently in a different ink crossed out, the greater the artist, the less we are aware of the type of man he is. Following this, in brackets, is Egyptian and Greek art. Although she had not found the appropriate words to convey her thoughts here, her meaning can be understood, I think. She wished to connect modern constructive art, and her own work particularly, to an eternal notion of art, while severing the elements that she considered surplus to that notion: representation, symbolism, narrative. Moss, of course, uses the term man conventionally as the ungendered individual. She certainly was including herself. Moss saw constructivism as an artistic lingua franca that overrides personality and biography. Her statement here in the first issue of Abstraction Création of 1932, accompanying the two works here, explores this theme, translating from the French here. Natural forms, in effect, an element of an unchanging and universal truth. This means these forms are composed of two elements, that is, one changeable element in that they are visible forms, and one unchangeable element in that they belong to this universal truth, which is not visible. Their true value, therefore, is not found in their visible form, but in the relation that exists between this form and the universe. I aim to construct pure plastic art that will be able to express in totality the artist's consciousness of the universe. Despite the complexity of Moss's expression, a Neoplatonic mode of thinking can be understood. Moss, as a constructivist, held the individual's experience of existence in the present moment as central to the artist's endeavour. Her conception of that experience is in relation to the universe rather than her immediate surroundings or the city streets, as with other modernist movements. For the next issue, Moss showed this work. Years later, in 1955, it was bought from her directly by Jean Arp for his collection. The Abstraction Création members were asked to address questions about the relationship of their work to nature. Moss responded, "What is the influence of trees on my painting? I must answer with another question, what is art?" If this was the question that concerned Moss at the time, the question that is now more often brought to bear on her work is, what is originality? Her work of this period, the early 30s, can look very similar to that of Mondrian, and conversely, his work looks very similar to that of Moss. They were working very closely together in studios on neighbouring Parisian streets. If Mondrian's work is known and Moss is approached only from this perspective, she generally hasn't come off well. This is often a problem when seeking to present the work of an unknown female artist to an audience familiar with a canon that has historically favoured men. In 1949, the Sidney Janis Gallery in New York held an exhibition called Artist, Man and Wife, which featured couples such as Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, clearly inviting comparisons. The reviewer in Art News commented, "There is a tendency among some of the wives to tidy up their husband's style," making the considerable assumption that the men's work in every case was primary. This kind of sexist and patronising language appears again and again in the critical response to Moss, always viewing her in relation to Mondrian. John Russell said in his 1958 review of her solo gallery at the Hanover, of her solo show at the Hanover Gallery, painting of this sort, with its precision, its nice calculations, and its perfection of finish, could be called a department of the housewifely arts, but Miss Moss's exhibit radiates over and above this a distinction of mind which makes her much more than a follower of her master. It's a good review to an extent, but the unfortunate introduction of the industrious housewife idea is elaborated upon by another reviewer a week later in what appears to be an extraordinary outpouring of misogyny. Keith Sutton writes, however strict and puritanical may be her aesthetic intentions, the total and immediate impression I gathered from this exhibition was the strongly evocative one of some southern coastal resort getting itself spick and span for the season. Mondrian made abstract statements independent of illusion and capable of gravity. Moss makes similar material capable of illusion to sunshine dazzle and the mood induced by a new coat of paint. Moss adds, certainly, brightness to whiteness. This slogan, adds brightness to whiteness, was used in an Omo washing powder advertisement of the 50s and would have been immediately recognisable to Sutton's readers. He goes on, in the paintings, the strict rectilinear areas of near primary colours are given more genteel functions than was the case with Mondrian. The idea of geometry is used rather like a housewife with an effective hygienic gadget. Tellingly, when Moss is assumed to be a man, reviewers use adjectives such as uncompromising rather than housewifely. And this is a relief called White and Yellow in the Tate collection. And Tate has recently released an audio description video of this work in their collection, and it's subtitled too, and available on their website, and I highly recommend looking that up. What I believe to be a computer-generated vocalizer gives a detailed formalist appraisal of this painted relief that I think Moss would enjoy. She did, after all, request us to look at her work without prejudice. White and Yellow is one of the earliest works Moss made with string and canvas. The work is strikingly geometrical, all angles are right angles, and lines and elements within the design are parallel with the edges of the base canvas and with each other. And so it continues in a very literal description of the physical elements and materials. Maybe no more commentary is needed. My little book for the Eider Down series is a precious thing because it makes accessible images of Moss works that have been previously hard to come by. We've included works held in private collections and works belonging to Tate and Leeds in the UK, works held in public collections in the Netherlands and France, and also MoMA in New York and the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, as well as presenting the work and Moss as an artist to an audience who may not be familiar with her, and simply celebrating her extraordinary achievements. I want to bring in the discourses that have surrounded her. I've tried to address the difficulties inherent in the appraisal of a neglected artist and one of indeterminate gender identity, and give some idea of the journey I have been on as a researcher. I don't for a minute feel that the subject is resolved. There is more to be said about Marlow Moss.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you very much for that fascinating introduction to the world of Marlow Moss. I can take some questions from the audience. So if you have one and you're listening, please pop it into the Q&A now. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. While we wait for those to come in, Lucy, I had a couple of questions which I'd like to ask you to start us off. So we say on the back of your book that Marlow Moss is arguably as important to the history of modern art as that of her friend and contemporary Piet Mondrian. What do you think was the key factor in the way that Moss's work has subsequently been remembered? Why is Mondrian a name that we've all heard, but not Marlow Moss? Was it her gender, her queerness, her decision to go to Cornwall, not New York, because of the writing out of art history, which has happened to women artists in the 20th century, or something else?
It's certainly all of those things. I think often the way art history is understood and conceptualized and written about, the way it works as a discipline, you tend to have one protagonist to tell the story of constructivism or neoplasticism. You just need Mondrian, and so no artist really works in isolation like that, and Mondrian certainly didn't. There was a lot of people around him in Paris working together and alongside each other, developing these ideas. Van Doesburg, who is another known name, but also Jean Gorin, Georges Fontenelleau. There were lots of other artists, male artists, whose names have been forgotten, as well as Marlow Moss. So I think that's just kind of a function of art history, and maybe a kind of problem with the discipline. So many other reasons. I mean, the simple answer is yes, her gender and her queerness are undoubtedly factors in her omission. And that is important, and that needs to be addressed. But I think there's other ways that there's a lack of fit between Moss and the available narratives around her. It's sometimes she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was in Paris when Nicholson and Garbo and John Leslie Martin were putting together Circle, which is a publication in this country which documented constructivist art. And so she was left out of that. And because she was left out of that book, that was published in 1937, she then gets left out of subsequent books in this country. So
she just gets lost in the...
Yes, she just kind of she falls between stools, I think. I mean, she was very much a kind of outsider wherever she was. She was, and when she was in Paris, she was an English artist in Paris, but when she was in England, she was kind of considered to be foreign, or she was a European artist really in England. So she kind of falls between stools, and she did decide to go to Cornwall rather than New York, and against Mondrian's advice, and possibly she would have much greater legacy if she'd gone to New York and been part of that. But she chose to go to Cornwall, and then she chose to stay in Cornwall. She was intending on going back to France, but she was waiting for war damages for her home in France that had been bombed. And then she had the exhibitions at the Hanover Gallery in the 50s, and so she became very busy with that, and then she died in 1958. So I think maybe things could have been different for her if she'd been geographically in different places and made connections. I mean, she tried to make connections with the very active scene in Cornwall, and was just rejected and ostracized by Ben Nicholson and that coterie. So I think it's very complicated, a lot of reasons why she's been left out. I think she just didn't fit in all sorts of ways.
And I guess one of those as well is her queer identity, which is something I wondered whether we just touch on that, whether you could say more about the kind of problem of Moss's identity when we talk about her at this point in history. In your book, you refer to her as her and use female pronouns. Maybe you could just say a little bit about why you chose to do that, and also something about how other museums who are presenting her work now are choosing to talk about her.
Yes, I think the language around this discourse is really changing and developing, and I have always used female pronouns when talking about Moss. I kind of followed the lead of her partner, Nettie Nehov, who refers to Moss as she and her in published writing and on film. But of course, the option of there or a gender neutral term wasn't there for Moss or for Nehov after Moss's death in the 60s when she was writing about Moss. So the option wasn't there. So I don't know how Moss would have felt about that. I mean, Moss didn't write anything at all about her own perception of her identity, her gender identity. The only thing that goes anywhere near that, that's why I emphasised it so much, is the Artists International Association application form, where she doesn't say that she's Miss, which I suppose is what she would have been expected to say. She just ignores the requirement for a prefix altogether. So yes, you could use that as an argument to say that Moss would consider herself to be gender neutral. I think you could consider her to be trans male. All these things could be brought to bear on Moss, but I'm quite wary of making assumptions or imposing 21st century paradigms on her. I've not considered myself to be a biographer. I don't feel that I know Moss in that way, and she doesn't present that to us. So I really just look at her work, and that's what she was interested in.
And I think it'd be really interesting, sort of what happens, you know, in over the next few years as her work, you know.
I think things are really, really changing. I think it's becoming more and more common to use there, and the more people use it, the less awkward it feels and sounds. And I think decisions have been made by institutions to start using a gender neutral pronoun for Moss, and I think the video made by Take Shots with Sacha Valeur is really, really interesting from that perspective. And I think, yeah, things are changing, and it's a really interesting issue. It is hard. It's not. I don't think of it as a problem for Moss. It's more of a problem for art historians now, talking about a historical person, historical figure. So.
Okay, and then just we have got a couple of questions. So there was just one other thing I wanted to ask you about, if I can. We always see Moss as a fully formed constructivist, and you mentioned this in your book. We don't get to see any early figurative studies or any drawings from her student days. And I was particularly thinking about this because of the forthcoming book on Nina Hamnet, where we found a couple of really early pieces, and it tells you, it's so interesting, it tells you so much about the artist and their progression. Can I ask, do you know whether there are any early works by Marlow Moss that still exist? Have you seen anything in the years that you've spent researching her?
I've never seen any early figurative works in the flesh. I would really be very, very interested to see early works by Moss. I don't know if she purposefully destroyed them to kind of preserve herself just as a constructivist, but over the years I have kind of heard anecdotally of early figurative works, and there's what might be an early self-portrait of Moss in a private collection, sort of a cubist could have been a student work from the Académie Moderne when she was being taught by Léger, maybe, which was very, very interesting. But it kind of bears no relation to the work that she's known for. So it would be really, really interesting to see early works. And that is kind of, it would help me to tell a story in a kind of conventional way of an artist's personal development, but it's kind of not really that's not really been the approach of my research, I don't think. And it can be a problem if Moss is always represented with her late work, her work from the 50s, because earlier work, even constructivist earlier work from the 20s and the 30s, and a lot was destroyed, a lot has been lost. And so we do, most of the work that we have is work from the 50s, and that can cause a problem for curators trying to represent Moss, because it looks like she's an artist whose practice happened in the 50s, when actually that was the very late work, and she's an artist of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. So it can cause difficulties for the art historian, I think, that there is no that there's no earlier work.
I think actually that's quite common actually with women artists, particularly. I think, you know, you do find that works are destroyed or they're lost, or, you know, that because they're not collected or they're not in museums, or they're starting to come to museums now. I think that seems to be a recurring story that we find with women artists from this period, I think. Let me turn to, there are a couple of questions. So the first is from Jane, and she says, if Marlow Moss didn't interact with the St Ives artists, what was her artistic support network?
Well, she had a lot of friends from her time in Paris. So she was very good friends with Georges Fontenelleau, and she was friends with Jean Gorin and Mondrian and all those artists I've mentioned who are in that circle in Paris. And then she, in England, she was quite isolated in some ways. She was isolated from that whole movement and scene in Paris, but she did make friends in this country. And I guess Paul Vézelay, the artist that Harriet mentioned earlier, was a good friend of hers. There's a lot of correspondence between Moss and Vézelay in the Tate archives, and they worked together trying to do a British branch of Groupe Espace, which was also very ill-fated. She did know Eiffel Colquhoun, and she must have known Gluck as well in Cornwall. And she was good friends with Stanley Gardner in Lamorna, who was an impressionist painter. He actually let her share his studio for a time before she set up her own studio. So she was perfectly social and had friends. She's sometimes kind of portrayed as this complete loner, which isn't quite true. And she did know Garbo a little bit. She knew Max Bill is another artist that she was good friends with. Yeah, she didn't ever manage to forge any kind of relationship with Bowen Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth, although I believe her and Hepworth did have tea together once in Paris before the war. So I don't know what happened at that meeting, but it didn't result in a friendship.
Just quickly, there's two more questions, one that's just come in, so and it's 10 to 8. So Sarah Davis asks, Marlow says that works of art are the creation of the conscious, i.e. the rational mind, but the criticisms of her, for example, that she adds brightness to whiteness, refer to emotionality. Is it that there is an emotional content and response to her work that she doesn't see or acknowledge, but that her male critics see and reject and deny?
Well, she does talk about the aesthetic emotion, in that I read the little catalogue extract from what she wrote in the catalogue from the Ara Gallery. And in that little essay, she does talk about aesthetic emotion. So she's talking about arranging and subdividing and cutting the forms until they provoke an aesthetic emotion. So it's, I mean, I don't think she ever expresses herself very clearly in writing. I think her writing is quite kind of, she obviously struggles with it herself, and with all the crossings out in her manuscript. So I think she was very opposite to Mondrian. Mondrian worked intuitively and was very much emphasised the spiritual dimension of his work, and she was completely coming from the opposite direction, and her work was about carefully working out mathematics and the geometry and making a complete plan before she executed the work in a very methodical way. So even though there is absolutely very strong similarities between her work and Mondrian's, they're very, very different. It's really hard to say the relationship between what she intends for her work and how it's received. I just thought that that particular review was just so shockingly outrageously unfair and sexist that yeah.
We've got one more question, I think. I can squeeze this in quickly. It's from Una Richmond, who says, Moss seems to have exhibited extensively in Europe, but not so much in group exhibitions in the UK. Una's researching the Women's International Art Club and says that Moss exhibited with them from 1951 to 55 in London at the same time as Ethel Colquhoun. And she's wondering whether this women's group may have offered an empathetic space for Moss to exhibit.
So, sorry, you said Moss exhibited in the women's group?
That's, yes, research Women's International Art Club. And Moss.
That's great. I don't know about that. That's very interesting.
It's 1955.
Okay, she exhibited at the Artists International Association, but it wasn't specifically exhibition for women. She exhibited an exhibition called Measurement and Proportion, which had figurative work and non-figurative work, but it certainly wasn't exclusively women. I don't know about the exhibition Society for Women. I would be very interested to hear more about that. She also exhibited in Paul Vézelé's Groupe Espace show at the Royal Festival Hall. I think she was also in a group show at the Hanover Gallery. But yes, she didn't often, she wasn't part of, she also exhibited with the Penworth Society once, I think. But yes, mainly her groups were in Europe, not England.
Okay, that's really interesting. Maybe that sounds like a conversation to carry on.
Yeah, please do tell me about this. I don't know about that. That sounds very interesting. I'd love to hear more from you if you could contact Harriet or Five Leaves.
We can definitely put you in touch. Okay, so I should finish there. Thank you, Lucy, for tonight, and to Five Leaves for hosting us, and to Benjamin for signing the event, and to Louise for captioning. And the event will be available to watch again on the Five Leaves YouTube channel soon. And thank you to our audience for joining us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.